My head is actually still spinning from this news. It took me a couple days to wrap my mind around the implications of what President Trump has done. So I'm not trying to create some dramatic build-up here. I'm just trying to wait for everybody to join. But what I'm talking about, of course, is the new recommended childhood immunization schedule from the CDC. Finally, guys, finally, how long have we, Maha moms, been waiting for this? Finally, that vaccine schedule has been not just slightly altered, but absolutely slashed, ripped to pieces. I mean, to call this a huge decision would be the understatement of the year. It's revolutionary, it's paradigm shifting, and the argument that I'm going to make today is that this is the most significant thing that President Trump has ever done. And I know that's a pretty bold claim to make, but let me walk you through why this is such a big deal. I actually had this conversation a couple weeks ago with Glenn Beck. We were talking about basically news stories is what we were discussing. News stories that were the biggest news stories of 2025. And I had said, I think Charlie Kirk's assassination is the biggest story of 2025. And Glenn said, yes, in many ways it is, but also if you're talking about the amount of news coverage or the feelings elicited by a news story, then yes, that was certainly the biggest story of 2025. But if you look at it through a slightly different lens, what happened this year that will have the most far-reaching impacts in the years to come on not just our country at large, but on our families, on our children, on our lives. He said, I think that changes how you would choose what the most significant news stories of 2025 are. And I think, I stand by what I said. I don't think that our country's ever experienced anything as significant as, at least in my lifetime, many of our lifetimes, as Charlie Kirk's assassination. But this decision at the CDC to change the childhood vaccination schedule is not just a big win for this administration or for this year or something that's going to gain a lot of headlines and be really dramatic. This is going to have generational impacts long after President Trump is out of office, long after he's dead, long after you and I are dead. This is going to have impacts, significant impacts on our society at large because of how it impacts our children. So this is what happened. The CDC has a committee called ACIP. Now, the ACIP committee is supposed to recommend to the CDC, and then, of course, the HHS at large, supposed to recommend which vaccines should go on the recommended child immunization schedule or which vaccines not to recommend. And when ACIP was originally retooled by Secretary Bobby Kennedy, he put a lot of people on there. We were very excited about many of the members that were put on ACIP. We thought, okay, this is going to elicit the radical change to the vaccine schedule that we want, that we've been advocating for. The reason why we danced and cried with joy when President Trump shook hands with Bobby Kennedy on that stage during the campaign, when MAGA married Maha. But ACIP didn't. They haven't yet made very many significant changes. They made a couple changes, and we'll get to those in a minute. However, now the CDC has taken action to reduce the recommended doses, the recommended vaccine doses for children in the United States from 88 doses. If you can believe, that's how many doses of vaccines were recommended for children and adolescents in our country. They've reduced the recommended doses from 88 to 55. They almost slashed it in half. From think about like that, that visual that we see in that meme all the time online. It's like a baby and just surrounded by needles pointing to this baby. And that's the number of vaccines that babies and toddlers and children and adolescents in our country are, quote unquote, supposed to get, according to the CDC. Almost half of those have now been removed from the recommended childhood immunization schedule. So now, instead of 17 different vaccines, because remember, a vaccine generally comes with several doses spread out over a matter of months and years. So it's 17 vaccines, 88 doses of those 17 vaccines, has now been cut to 11 vaccines. So instead of the 17 with the 88 doses, it's now 11 vaccines with a total of 55 doses. Still too many. We'll get to that in a moment too. But what has been removed from the recommended childhood schedule, the COVID-19 vaccine has been removed. The influenza vaccine has been removed. Hepatitis A and hepatitis B have both been removed. The rotavirus vaccine has been removed, and the meningitis, the meningitis vaccines, there's two different ones, but it's usually under the same category. Those have both been removed from the recommended childhood immunization schedule. Listen, this is what we voted for. This is what we voted for. This is why we voted for President Trump. And he's done it. He's done it. And by the way, and this might be why I am making the case that this is the most significant thing that Trump has ever done, because if you remember back in 1986, a law was passed by the United States Congress and signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. And the title of that law is the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. And the implications of that particular piece of legislation at the time hardly even ranked in the top 10 things people most cared about out of the Reagan administration. I mean, think of all the things Reagan did and how much, all the impacts he had around the globe, his war on communism that helped topple the Soviet regime, his, free market economics here in the United States that ushered in a generation of economic prosperity. All of these different things that Ronald Reagan didn't turn out to be one of the most significant, or it didn't turn out to be the most significant thing that Ronald Reagan did. The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act is the thing I would argue had one of the most detrimental and greatest effects on the lives of the American people following 1986, because what the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act did is it insulated vaccine manufacturers from liability. So if a vaccine manufacturer produced a vaccine, that vaccine was administered to a child, that child had some sort of adverse reaction, significant, an injury, all the way up to death. Before the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, well, the parents had a right to sue the vaccine company. This is kind of standard consumer protection in the United States. And so the big pharma companies, these vaccine manufacturers, were forced to a certain extent to make sure that their products were safe, because they didn't want to be put out of business by bringing to the market a product that hurt people that they would then have to be responsible for. And by the way, that's exactly how it's supposed to work. They should have been extra cautious about what they were bringing to the market to inject into children, because it might hurt children. And it's a just accountability mechanism to have them be liable for their product. But what the vaccine manufacturers did when Reagan was in office is they blackmailed him. They came to him and they said, listen, if you don't take liability away from us, if you don't insulate us, give us immunity, then we're going to stop producing these vaccines. So they threatened him. They completely threatened him. And Ronald Reagan ended up in the United States Congress, and you know how compromised the United States Congress is with big pharma cash. The United States Congress caved, and Ronald Reagan caved because they didn't want to be blamed if vaccines that saved lives and eradicated diseases were pulled from the market. The finger would have been pointed, they believed, because this is what big pharma threatened. The finger would have been pointed at them. It was Ronald Reagan's fault that your child died. It was the United States Congress's fault that there was a measles outbreak. And Ronald Reagan and the United States Congress are much like politicians today. They cannot stand a threat, and they cave very easily. I'm sorry if that sounds black-pilled, but the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act ushered in an era of corruption. Following the passage of that act, the number of doses of vaccinations recommended for American children skyrocketed. And at the exact same time that the number of vaccinations skyrocketed, we saw a chronic health crisis unfold among American children. We saw ADHD skyrocket. We saw autism diagnoses skyrocket. We saw neurological and developmental disorders of all different kinds skyrocket. We saw skin issues and verbal issues and continence issues. We saw an absolute sledgehammer dropped on our children. And we were told we weren't allowed to observe why that was. Well, of course we know why that was, because big pharma and vaccine manufacturers were insulated from responsibility for their own products. So what did they do? They stood to profit if they could get their vaccine on the recommended schedule, because they only enjoyed that immunity from liability if their vaccine was on the CDC's recommended childhood immunization schedule. So all these vaccines began to be added to this schedule. How did they get added? Because there's a revolving door between the big pharma companies, these vaccine manufacturers, and positions at HHS and the CDC and the FDA. If you vote in favor of a vaccine when you're at the CDC, wink, wink, you can cash out in a few years. There'll be a nice cushy office job waiting for you. Plenty of benefits, lots of money, because we take care of our own, big pharma. Let it be known. And so you saw this revolving door of swamp creatures who added vaccine after vaccine after vaccine to the childhood schedule because it immunized big pharma against liability. And then you saw these politicians reaping the financial benefits from it. This is about to change. This is not just a matter of President Trump changing the childhood recommended immunization schedule only to have the next administration or the next administration, whenever we're, God forbid, whenever we suffer a leftist president again, to change it back. This is going to have much deeper ramifications because when these certain vaccines, the ones I mentioned before, meningitis, rotavirus, Hep B, Hep A, influenza, COVID, when all those vaccines have been moved out of the recommended place in the schedule, and now they're in a category called shared clinical decision making, which means if you want those vaccines for your children, and can't imagine that you would, if you want those vaccines, you can still get them. And President Trump says insurance companies will still pay for it. But if a vaccine is in the shared clinical decision making category versus the universal recommended category, then it does indeed remove that vaccine and their manufacturer from the liability protection that they enjoyed under the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. Now, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, that's what was established by the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. The Vaccine Injury Compensation Program is a way of hushing families whose children have been harmed by vaccine. It says, you know what? We are, without any culpability or admission of guilt, going to acknowledge that your child was harmed by the vaccine, and we, the government, are going to give you money to compensate you. But of course, you have to be quiet, and we're not going to admit any guilt. We're just going to pay you off. No more. No longer. If your child gets the rotavirus vaccine, the COVID vaccine, the flu vaccine, the Hep A vaccine, the Hep B vaccine, or meningitis, and then your child suffers an injury, you will now be able to sue Big Pharma. So this is not President Trump makes a change with an executive order and the next administration that's leftist changes it back. We now have before us years of opportunity for harmed consumers, God forbid, to hold these Big Pharma companies accountable. This is paradigm shifting stuff. It's revolutionary. It's absolutely revolutionary. And it's also the reason, by the way, that pediatricians all over X are having emotional breakdowns. And I know that some of you are going to say to me, and you're right, by the way, some of you are going to say to me, Liz, all pediatricians aren't corrupt. Liz, a lot of pediatricians genuinely care about the kids, and they aren't just shills of Big Pharma. And I'm sure you're right. And I'm excited to meet one that fits your description someday. Just like I'm excited to see an albino rhino, because they exist somewhere, but they're never there when I'm at the zoo. Pediatricians all over X are freaking out. There's a doctor by the name of Dr. Annie Andrews who said congrats to the rotavirus lobby for this win for preventable infectious voluminous diarrhea. Of course, she's trying to be facetious, but she's talking about rotavirus, which is a GI bug that can be severe for young children, especially for infants. And she's saying, the rotavirus vaccine or the rotavirus lobby was trying to save children's lives. And I responded to her and I said, listen, congrats to Paul Offit. Do you recognize that name, Paul Offit? Dr. Paul Offit was a vaccine employee at HHS under, a lot of the past administrations. And he's about as corruptly entrenched in vaccine ideology as it's possible to be. And I said to Dr. Andrews, I said, congrats to Dr. Paul Offit for corruptly getting a rotavirus vaccine on the recommended childhood immunization schedule in the first place. Oh, conveniently, right before he got rid of it. He got rid of that old rotavirus vaccine. He pulled their approval status and inserted his own rotavirus vaccine that had already been in development when he approved the rotavirus vaccine that he eventually yanked approval from, which, of course, Paul Offit's rotavirus vaccine is known to cause a side effect called intussusception, which is a long medical word for extreme bowel impaction that can and does lead to death in infants. All for a virus that can be mitigated in severe cases with IV fluids and anti-nausea meds. But of course, Dr. Andrews is a doctor, so she knows all that, right? Of course she knows all that. Listen, to all the pediatricians who are suffering emotional breakdowns on X and online everywhere, all across the board this week, thanks to President Trump's executive order, studies show, if you look up the political leanings of doctors and you look up the political leanings of doctors in different specialties, it's a really interesting graph that shows you that orthopedic surgeons, for example, are the most conservative doctors out there, which anybody who's met an orthopedic surgeon, that is kind of the stereotype. That is the stereotype of an orthopedic surgeon, to be, very overconfident, kind of egomaniac, maybe kind of loud, but also right wing. And then, of course, the two most liberal specialties, if you're a doctor, are being a psychiatrist. Yeah, we know. And being a pediatrician. And so, studies show this. This is not my speculation. Studies show that pediatricians skew heavily to the left. And so, listen, it's a new concept for them this week, but let me just speak the truth plainly to you. You were lied to by the people who trained you to be a doctor. Your dogmatic religious beliefs in vaccinology are not actually based in science, even though you were told they are based in science. They're not. You'll notice that you were told statistics and told standards of practice without ever being told the why. You never read the studies. You were just assured that there were studies that backed up and substantiated you trying to enforce the recommended childhood immunization schedule. But the studies that pediatricians refer to without reading them first are biased. They're corrupt. Oftentimes they're fake because they've been manipulated by pharma interests that profit. Do you know what the pharma industry profits per year? $90 billion a year from using pediatricians as the enforcers of their profiteering vaccine ideology that they suffer no liability for if they bring a dangerous product to market. And so I offered on X, and I highly recommend that you send this to every doctor that you know. Tell them, take a deep breath, think for yourself for once. Below are a selection of books that can show doctors the true evidence about vaccines that they did not learn in medical school and the diseases that the vaccines purport to address. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in starting with Dissolving Illusions. Now, after I posted that on X, I got some hilarious responses from pediatricians. Somebody goes, a podcaster with no medical or science credentials whatsoever tells me scientific studies are for libs, but her personal list of books is the way. I wonder if you can hear how dumb that sounds or if you're just that lost. Well, Michael, the books are written by doctors. So you might want to do your research before you comment. I don't want to make you look like a fool here, but you gotta kind of doing that to yourself. Also, you don't have to be a medical doctor to recognize that a vaccine study in which the control is portrayed as pure saline, but actually contains an aluminum adjuvant is biased. It's corrupt. It's unethical. And that's not a hypothetical example I gave you. The Gardasil vaccine, there was a study done about the Gardasil vaccine when it first came out. It was called the Future 2 study. You can look this up. They ran a study in which they claimed to have a control group, people who got a shot, but it wasn't supposed to be the vaccine. It was supposed to be just pure saline, so they could track what side effects happened to those who got the true vaccine and those who got the saline. But of course, the problem in many of these vaccines is the harm caused by the aluminum adjuvant. And so this study was so corrupted that even though they told the participants and portrayed their results as being a saline control, it actually had the same aluminum that the vaccine itself had in it. So when they came out and said, there's not much difference in the outcomes, the side effects in the two groups. Well, yeah, because the control group wasn't an actual control group. But something tells me that if you ask your pediatrician for the name of that study, that your pediatrician won't know that. Now, again, I want to be charitable here. I'm trying to be charitable here to the medical community. There was a physician who reached out to me on X and said, I'm not a pediatrician, but I am a physician. Until 2020, I trusted what I was taught. I trusted what I saw in peer-reviewed journals. I trusted colleagues who I knew were smart. And now I trust none of it. The studies, he said, were skewed and fudges. The information was biased and the colleagues were brainwashed. So sick. And I just want to take a moment and speak to this physician because one of the things I have the highest respect for is when people are willing to change their mind when they realize they were wrong. when new information is presented to them and they are willing to allow that information to impact their decision-making algorithm. These new variables impact the result. I actually call it the highest form of intelligence to be able to do that, because it's an extremely difficult thing to do, to set aside social influences, to question the experts, and to allow just dispassionate, cold, hard data inform you of the truth. And so, sir, I'm sure the Liz Wheeler Show community joins you in saying mad props for changing your mind. You are the kind of doctor that we need more of in our country. No doubt about that. Okay, so that's not the only thing that's happened. That's not the only thing from HHS. Before we go on to the new food pyramid and the implications of that, it's not just a pretty new picture here. I want to note who you have to thank for the updated recommended childhood immunization schedule. It's one person that you have to thank, and that person is President Donald Trump. It's not HHS. There are good people at HHS. I like Bobby. I like some of the people that work for him. There are some good people at CDC. There are some good people in the MAHA movement. But we've had control of HHS for almost a year now. And the ACIP committee that's supposed to make changes to the vaccine schedule, to be frank, I was very excited when some certain people were appointed to that board. And I'm not going to point fingers and name names because I don't know who it is that's being kind of lame on ACIP. But they haven't done anything super significant. They changed the Hep B vaccine from the day of birth to like 2 months. Okay, whoopee, that's not getting rid of it. They changed the COVID vaccine and took it away from small children. Yeah, you think that's just restoring normalcy because it's an mRNA technology that has not been tested in control groups. I don't like to praise people for simply returning to normalcy. It wasn't enough. And then on December 5th, 2025, 1 month ago, President Trump issued an executive order. President Trump's executive order directed the Department of Health and Human Services and Secretary Kennedy and everyone he works for to align the U.S. recommended childhood immunization schedule with other developed countries around the world, because the United States was somewhat of an anomaly. We recommended way more vaccines for kids, and yet our health status and outcomes for these children was inferior to other countries like Denmark or Japan, countries whose vaccine schedule is much lighter. 1 month after President Trump issued that executive order, we see 88 doses reduced to 55 doses, 17 vaccines reduced to 11 vaccines, thanks to President Trump. This is what Maha moms voted for. This is, Mr. President, the most significant thing that you have ever done. And I say that knowing how significant most of your actions this year were, with our foreign policy around the world, with tariffs, to restoring justice, to the definition of justice, to the Justice Department. This is the most significant thing President Trump has ever done, and we have him to thank. And don't get me wrong, 6 down, 11 to go. But it's okay to celebrate this victory because that's exactly what it is.